agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing fantastic, actually. This is an exciting project we're going to be starting off here. But you got some words to say about last week's show and other exciting events coming up with Politics Guys.
Yeah, absolutely. I am looking forward to this Federalist Papers project as well. But yeah, just really briefly, before we get into that, listeners, as you know, that last week was our first episode where I co-hosted with May Mailman, and I really enjoyed having her on. And I just wanted to kind of let folks know what was going on with that. If you've been a listener for a while, you'll recall that we used to have a hosting team of me. Kristen and I hosted the show together, and Kristen, unfortunately, was basically driven from the show by some knuckleheads who decided that they didn't like what she had to say, and they were going to try to get her in trouble or fired at her day job for that, which, God. But in any case, so I totally understand her decision to do that. But since she's left, our partisan balance has been, I think, a little more left than I would like. And certainly, G, I think you'd agree that, the DNA of this show is, well, left and right. And it's been a little bit more left than right since Kristen left, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so
I've had to work a whole lot harder, Mike. Not that I can't do it, but
and Jay and some of my friends on the right have binders of binders full of women, conservative women. And after looking through those binders, Jay suggested, well, maybe we should talk with May, and I did, and it was we had just a great conversation, and she came on the show, and a few people mentioned, well, it seemed sort of like in that first episode that May had more time than you did, Mike. And my first thought was, really? And so I did what I'd like to think any good social scientist did. I went to the data and I looked at the audio, and yeah, it was kind of like 57-43 May. And I think there were some reasons for that. Number one is she was just kind of new to the show, and I was kind of curious to what she would have to say about certain things, and just wanted to be more welcoming. But also, I think the topics that we had in the news cycle that week, the Durham report, immigration, the Republican presidential field, and those Supreme Court decisions, they just happened to be things that we agreed on, I think, to a certain extent. On Durham, Jay, you'll recall that from the beginning, I was saying that, hey, I think there should be, I was in favor of Barr appointing him, and I think he's a straight shooting kind of guy, and we should take seriously, what he says. And so that's maybe not the progressive left line on John Durham, but it was my line. And so I think it's just kind of how it went. But in the future, and I think May is planning on being back on a regular basis, and certainly I'm happy about that. It'll be a little bit, there'll probably be a little bit more disagreement, I would expect. But anyway, I just wanted to let folks know about that. I'm excited to have May be part of the show and to kind of bring back more of a straight down the line conservative liberal balance that Jay and I founded the show on. So there we go. All right. So Jay, the Federalist Papers. You're a big fan. Yeah, right.
I am a big fan, and this is a project that came to my mind early in the year. Part of my job as of late, I've done a fair number of briefs where I've gone back to consult the Federalist Papers, and I got to the point of I really enjoyed reading them, and it's one of these I had read the Federalist Papers back in college, and read perhaps in quotes, right? There may have been sort of some skimming involved, and maybe skipped a couple of them. But it brought back a familiarity, and with anything of when you read it when you're young, a lot of times it's wasted on the youth, on the youth is wasted on the young, sort of thing. You don't fully appreciate it then as you do later in life. And particularly later in life, after you've had more experience with politics and law and government and all that. So I sat down and started reading through the Federalist Papers, and I was struck by how they speak really to our times. And we'll go through some pieces and quotes, but stuff that could be written today. In addressing a divided country, and also how you argue and the virtues of the back and forth of argument. So, and also some sort of things that I think are timeless parts of what are the American character, that you and I talk about every now and again, Mike. But this really brings it into pretty clear relief, I think, in that some of these arguments are so right on compared to arguments that are going on today. Balancing an effective government with liberty, right? Those are big issues, and the reactions that engenders in both. So the other reason, Mike, that I guess the question, not the reason, is why should we, care about what these group of dead white men said, 230 years ago? Did I do that right? 200, more or less 230 years ago. Yeah, more or less. I should have counted out but anyway. And to me, there's a couple big reasons, and I ran across this almost just serendipitously in other reading, is that, in terms of United States, we define ourselves, and it's almost a cliche, right? But as a nation built on ideas, rather than a nation that arose out of some, here's where this tribe lived on this side of the river for the last 1,000 years until some other tribe had come and, when they kicked out some other tribe. But this is a nation that is actually built on concepts and ideas. And it's important, I think, to go back and see what those ideas are and were. And that doesn't mean you have to necessarily agree with those ideas, because there's always that response, right? Of look, why should we care what people 230 years ago said? And some of those very same type people, although he wasn't involved in drafting the Federalist Papers, but Thomas Jefferson would have agreed with you, right? Some of the anti-federalists that we're going to talk about also would have agreed with that position of, look, this shouldn't be permanent. This is an arrangement for this generation, and other people should figure it out. So I think that's a fair argument. But in order to have that argument, you have to start with, here's what those ideas actually were. And another piece in de Tocqueville, Mike, who I know you're a fan of, wrote, in order that society should exist, it's required that the minds of the citizens should be rallied and held together by certain predominant ideas. Likewise, this comes up again in Lincoln's first inaugural, when he talks about the mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land. That the idea is that we've got something shared. We have a shared heritage, and that shared heritage applies to people who were born here, people who moved here, people who are coming here tomorrow. And to me, that's incredibly important in terms of when we have this very divided country. Let's look at what were these shared ideas that it's founded upon, and take a look at it. And the Federalist Papers. I will also throw this in, Mike. The edition I'm working off of is edited by Robert Siciliano, but it has a book blurb, which is perhaps one of the greatest, little blurbs that you'll ever find. And on the front it says, "The best commentary on the principles of government which was ever written, Thomas Jefferson." So it's when you get a blurb from Thomas Jefferson that says the best commentary on government, I think it's worthwhile to take a look. So, with that, I would also say all of this show will pair well with drum and fife music and a hard cider. So if you have that handy, I'd encourage you to get that. And the other piece that with the Federalist Papers is that this is readily available online from about 1,000 different sources, or there were so many editions that you can order online, get from your library that also come with helpful commentary. But this is why we're bringing this to you.
Well, Jay, when I reread, and I also did probably more skimming than reading, and even less skimming than you did, certainly, I was struck first by the language. And the language, I think I should point out, is both strangely compelling and also, I think, challenging to many modern readers, because these are people who thought in paragraphs. And so it does take a little bit of getting into. In other words, this is not the sort of thing you want to read when you're trying to do 2 or 3 other things. It asks for your attention, but I think it also rewards that attention. There's a musicality in there's a poetry in the way that they write. When I say they, and we talk about the Federalist, this is largely the Hamilton-Madison letters. Jay wrote a few of them, but he got sick early on and so wasn't able to do a whole lot. So something like Hamilton wrote around 2/3 and Madison around 1/3, roughly. But, I think it's interesting, Jay, that Hamilton, Madison, and Jay were both members of, I love this name, the Constitutional Convention's Committee of Style, which reminded me of that 80s band, Style Council. Not much of an overlap there, but no, style really is important, and it's a wonderful thing to see, I think. And so just on style alone, it's beautiful to read, as well as we'll be talking about the anti-federalists, and some of that is wonderful stuff to read for the same reasons, because people don't write like that anymore. And maybe that's a good thing generally, but it's nice to kind of dip back into that and appreciate the rhythms of a different age. So I just wanted to make that stylistic note.
And actually, Mike, you sort of stole one of my other points that I was about to make, and I was sort of thinking, oh, geez, I forgot to say that. But that's exactly, there is a sheer aesthetic pleasure in reading this stuff, I think. I once had a history professor who said that classical liberalism sounds like Mozart, right? And this there's a balance. There is this harmony, this back and forth. And I would say the Federalist Papers sound is sort of appropriate to when they're written. Not quite in Mozart, but maybe early Beethoven, right? Mozart with the little injection of some revolutionary zeal. So I think that what you hit on, the poetry, the musicality, is great, and yeah, they're worth reading just for the sheer literary value, I think. And as you said, the language can be a little obtuse sometimes, but in other ways, you read it and you're like, wow, I couldn't have said that any clearer. And I'm still, stunned with, these are people who are writing with quill and pen and having to go back and cross stuff out and rewrite and start over, and as opposed to, just cutting and pasting, that sort of thing that we do. I think this is a fantastic project. So with that, I think I will lead off just with a quick.
I was going to say one more thing, and maybe you were getting at this, but before we get into the Federalist Papers per se, I thought maybe we could talk just briefly about the Anti-Federalists. They haven't come up yet, but I think to understand, because in a weird way, and this is why I wanted to include the Anti-Federalists, we're about bipartisan argument or bipartisan discussion. Well, this was going on then, it's setting the stage right about should we ratify this Constitution, and there were these two camps. And I should point out that the Federalists very cleverly actually stole the moniker, the better moniker, when you can, I think, make a case that actually the Anti-Federalists were the true Federalists, but Hamilton, I guess, grabbed that name, right? And so no one wants to be the antis. But anyway, so maybe you were going to do that, but I think it's important to understand the context in which this was written so you can understand why this was such a big deal at the time. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The importance that this is a dialogue. So yeah, I mean, and I guess the context historically is that the Federalist Paper project began shortly after the Constitution was drafted, 1787, October of 1787, and of course, the reasons that the framers gathered to draft the Constitution originally, the plan was where they were going to get together and draft amendments to the Articles of Confederation, which had been drafted. One of the Federalist Papers mentioned sort of in haste during the Revolution, and the Articles of Confederation, going back to your ninth grade civics. The problem was it was extremely weak. It was a sort of more a legislative confederation type. Everybody gets to talk, but there was no executive function, and there was no sort of enforcement mechanism. And the problems that had surfaced in the years since the end of the Revolution in 1783 were extreme, and we can. There was some debate about that. A lot of the anti-federalists say, "Come on, quit complaining. It's not that bad. We don't need to throw out the entire government just because of this." But a lot of these issues had to do with war debts. Some states, not really states then. Well, I guess they were states. They were just their own, not United States. Said, no, we're not going to be on the hook for these. It should be borne by everyone. And some states said, well, we gave a whole lot more than others. There were also these interstate rivalries where commerce from one state was being blocked by another. Printing of money from different states, you just had a crazy economy. War veterans were not getting paid pensions that they were due. There was chaos, I think, Mike, to put it mildly. So some of the Constitution Project. Now, the book to read, I think, is Joseph Ellis's The Quartet. And I suppose I can be forgiven, right? I mean, Joseph Ellis is sort of, I guess, a popular historian, and it's not the serious multi-volume book that you could go and read about the Constitution Convention. But,
not that you would.
It makes
that's the point,
pardon?
right? I mean, yeah.
Right, exactly. And what I'm saying is Ellis is easier to get through. But it talks to you about Washington, Hamilton, John Jay, all of whom had this experience in the war, that they tended to see the country as one nation rather than multiple states. And that was a big issue because, Mike, historically even, and this sort of thing fascinates me, and we'll touch on this in Federalist 2 and also in Patrick Henry's response, is that, we talk about being one people, and in some ways we were, and in a lot of ways we weren't. During the Revolutionary War, soldiers from the North had difficulty understanding people from the South. Literally, they almost literally spoke a different language. And their regional variations were such a bigger deal. I mean, you think we have regional variations now. It much more so then. If you can imagine, right, before TV and radio, you wouldn't necessarily even hear how other people spoke unless you traveled there. So they gathered and decided what we needed was this more strenuous government with an executive.
But on that was one difference. But I want to point out another difference as well, is that it wasn't just sort of unified versus divided, federal versus state government control. But that was the key thing. But also, there were these different notions of responsibility to the public, meaning that, like, the Federalists sort of viewed responsibility more generally as, well, okay, yeah, you need to have direct responsibility to the people, some of that. But also, there was much more of a concern from the Federalists about this sort of, responsibility to posterity and a concern about what the passions of the mob might do. And so we need to kind of make sure that you don't have tyranny of the majority and right, these factions, whereas the anti-federalists were, I think, much more straightforward. No, you need to be responsive to the people, because they were more concerned about the tyranny of the elites if there weren't that direct responsibility. So things like, what do you mean that the president's not going to be directly elected, or that the small and large states are going to have similar representation in the Senate, which, by the way, isn't directly elected either, and 6-year terms and no term limits? Are you nuts? So, I mean, there were a lot of really fundamental differences in not just whether there should be a unified national government, but how responsive that government should be, and in what ways that government should be responsive to the people. And that echoes a lot of differences that we see still today.
Exactly. The concern about elites, and also who is going to benefit from the new government. There, you'll see in the strain of the Anti-Federalists, very much the argument that this will benefit the rich, the elite, the money guys, right? The Hamilton type crowd. And conversely, the Federalists tend to argue, sort of quietly, sort of voce, that listen, no, this is really just a bunch of provincials who are trying to establish themselves as provincial big shots, and are concerned with sharing any authority with a federal government. So yeah, those are the types of debates that were going on then and are going on now. So with that, Mike, I'll lead off with Federalist number 1.
We hope you enjoyed this preview of our supporters exclusive midweek show. If you'd like to hear the rest of the episode, we hope you'll consider becoming a supporter. Supporters get ad-free access to all of our shows, membership in our Politics Guys Discord group where you can join in on the conversation, and other benefits at different levels of support. To become a supporter, go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through Venmo or @politicsguys, or through PayPal. You'll find all of our support links in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And if you'd like to get the midweek show, but you're not in a position to become a financial supporter, that's not a problem. Just send me an email at mike@politicsguys.com, and I'll be happy to get that set up for you.